Hello and welcome to the Point, a show on TV 25 about student opinions on world events. With me today are two high school juniors, Gavin Witter and Jason Allen. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
And I'm your host, Elliot Liu. Now, to the point. Well, the massive trust busting of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency has been lost to America for 80 years now. We still experience, amazingly enough, antitrust suits in this, our information age. With the wounds of the attacks on IBM and AT&T still open, Microsoft has now come under fire. To the issue, Microsoft, corporate monopoly or struggling superpower? Gavin?
Well, my opinion is kind of a mixed one. I see Microsoft as a very large corporation, but in the kind of a market, that is very dynamic, that's changing overnight. The whole idea of monopoly may have to be rethought when it comes to the kind of technological market that we're dealing with when it comes to Microsoft. For instance, entrepreneurs that I've heard on other news programs and things like that have said that Microsoft is kind of it's kind of there, but you can't guarantee that it's going to be at the top forever, because there are so many near instantaneous technological advances overnight and so on that are affecting the market so drastically. So I think that we should be very, very cautious if we decide that we're going to break up a company which obviously has been doing almost everything right for the American consumer.
Jason?
I'd have to say this issue brings to mind two really big important problems or issues, depending on how you want to think about them. The first is computers operating independently. A lot of computers, there's still a large amount of computers in the world that operate standalone. They have no network connection, they have no internet connection. The users, the people who run them, only use them for word processing, graphics, that kind of stuff. And then there's computers that exist largely as the part of the internet. There's cable modems now, 56.6 modems, even though they don't run that fast, they still are incredibly, compared to 2 years ago, speeds of data transmission and everything are incredibly fast compared to what they used to be. My computer, for instance, runs on a cable modem. It has a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week connection to the internet. So when you're talking about computers standing by themselves, Microsoft has taken a giant leap forward in that almost every single software developing company now makes their first edition of programs for Windows 95, which soon 98 will be the current running upgrade. But 95 is still by far the most, on a majority, the largest running system. And of course, last year with the big introduction, last year or 2 years ago, I can't quite remember, the introduction of Microsoft putting money into Apple and putting money into Macintosh to support their struggling efforts. Believe it or not, I mean, a long time ago, when you actually looked at it, before the big brouhaha of Microsoft putting money into Apple, Microsoft was actually writing 80% of the software for Macintoshes before the big thing that happened last year. So I think there's a lot more that goes into it, where recently, just because of lawsuits, people have begun to notice things.
I see.
So.
Well, gentlemen, let me throw this at you. Do you think that in the modern market with the internet and things like that, do you think that Microsoft classifies as a monopolizing company, akin to those of the robber baron conglomerates of the turn of the century? Gavin?
Well, this is an interesting point. I think that, like I said before, our whole definition of a monopoly may be in some jeopardy, because we are dealing with a kind of market, a very dynamic market, a market that changes overnight. We're not just talking about steel or oil or other natural raw materials and things like that we can produce, and you have a certain market, and once a certain company is cornered, a monopoly in that market, they have absolute control. I see that the computer market, that the technology market, which is changing overnight, search engines that are bigger and better and faster, as I understand it now. Jason may be able to help us out here a tremendous amount.
Recently, some of the better advances, search engine came out a couple years ago that really changed things, called Metacrawler. It actually does the search with up to 10 of the leading search engines and returns the best hits from those 10. Companies are developing search engines now that work on different kinds of processes. And I don't know the specifics, but they're developing entirely different ways of working now. So.
I see.
That's absolutely fantastic. So each and every one of these new products really opens up a different sort of market, a different sort of edge. So even if one company controls all of one market, my argument would be that overnight an innovation will bring on a new revolution in that technology, and you'll have a whole new market. And a market which the innovators, the entrepreneurs who invest in that market early on, be it the original company or be it some other company, those people will reap the profits.
I see. Jason, do you think that Microsoft, or indeed any company dealing in computer software, can classify as a monopoly?
As much as a lot of people like to call Microsoft a monopoly, it's not.
I see.
Even if the definition of monopoly is in jeopardy, which I would agree that it is, it's by the original definition, it's not a majority. Macintosh is still a very well-running system. I mean, lately Macintosh, they now have the claim that they have the fastest running computer on the market. And that leads to personal tastes. You know, do you want to be more involved with your computer, or do you want your computer to do more for you? That's when you decide whether or not you want a computer with Windows 95 or a Macintosh running system. I think Microsoft, a lot of people are saying that it's taking steps to become a monopoly. I haven't really seen that much concrete proof that it's heading towards a full-fledged, you know, we own everything, we run everything. If you don't come to us, you're nothing.
We can dictate the prices.
Right,
That's
kind of monopoly, because basically they're still taking steps that any corporation takes to make itself better.
Sure.
Self-improvement is something that every, you know, companies, people, as the world as a whole, we're always trying to improve everything. So who are we to say that a company that's merely trying to, you know, improve its stock holdings, improve its pricings, and all that other stuff is wrong? You know,
I see.
In my mind, it would take hardcore proof, documents from within the company saying that we're shooting for a completely controlled industry to actually convince me that Microsoft was leaning that way.
All right, and finally on this subject, gentlemen, do you think, moving off on tangent, that the government of today is flexible enough to deal with the rapid changes of our information age?
That's a fabulous question, I think. You know, we were looking at these wonderful shots of Bill Gates going in front of a Senate hearing, and you know how intimidating that sort of thing can be, and you know, with these other industry leaders in the technology market. And I'm not sure if it was Bill Gates or other people were very upset at how unknowledgeable these senators were about this kind of technology. I'm a tremendous optimist when it comes to the American system and the American government. Just ask anyone. I think that we can modify, and I think that that could even be a special niche for people who are running for Congress or for the Senate, or you know, and things like that. Is that, hey, I have experience in computers, I understand technology, I'm interested in science. You know, for instance, we have a congressman in Michigan who's a physicist. He was the first of his kind. I think that kind of a person in Congress, it's going to be a lot more popular to look at that. Economists, scientists, and stuff like that is qualifications for someone who we would like to put into power and who would end up making these kinds of calls. I do think our government will have the champions of free trade who will probably stand behind you know, behind companies like Microsoft that are trying to do business and trying to produce a better product. But at the same time, I'm quite sure that there will be trust busters on the other end who are going to want to annihilate anybody who has developed anything concrete, you know, any large, powerful business that they fear may be crushing other smaller businesses.
Jason?
I'd have to say that Microsoft as a whole, the government as a whole, if you want to cycle it down, there's some teachers within the school system who are totally and completely computer illiterate, and they're running grading programs on computers that have been around for 10 or 15 years. And when I sit in class sometimes and one of these teachers is working on this, and I look at them and how many times they frequently mess up because they don't know how to run it, it honestly scares me that my grade is in this person's hands. I mean, it's one thing to grade a paper, but it's another to take that grade, put it into a computer, and do it right so that it's calculated right. Computer illiterate people trying to run computer software has always been a problem. It's resulted in plane crashes, multiple deaths, lots of things like that. But when it comes to the government, a lot of the problem is the government still keeps a lot of data that they have, a lot of old records on outdated databases. And you can make software that would be compatible with it, but with today's standards, a new computer running an old database, the database wouldn't be able to keep up with the computer. So part of the problem is I think the government needs to take say once a decade or once every 20 years that the government needs to devote part of a yearly budget to, say, maybe modernizing everything. You know, part of the was it the Freedom of Information Act?
Freedom of Information Act,
Freedom of Information Act. Part of the problem acquiring that information is that computer systems aren't compatible enough to where you can get it.
You have to go through and thumb through
Yeah,
individual
you have
documents.
to, you know, card catalogs, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, where a computer can do it for you in seconds flat. But if the government doesn't have that information available to a computer, it doesn't do you any good.
I see. Well, thank you very much. On to another issue, the situation in Iraq. Many of our generation remember the Gulf War from our television sets, brought right into our homes by the wonders of modern warfare now. 6 years after the deadly struggle in the Persian Gulf has ended, things may once again be heating up in Iraq. Numerous chemical and biological weapons may be hidden within Iraq's borders against UN sanctions. The issue, after so many attempts at disarmament have failed, what options do we have left to us? Gavin?
Well, my position on Iraq, would be the same, I think, for any other nation which we, or, you know, this happened to be the UN, but we were definitely spearheading the whole operation in the Gulf, is that if you defeat them on the battlefield, you can dictate your terms to them. And I think that that's absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential that the Iraqi government, which is essentially Saddam Hussein, comply with those things which the international community has said again and again are absolutely compulsory if you're going to re-enter the world community. I think that that's vital. I think that that's essential, excuse me. And I think that the fact that Iraq is playing around with the United States, and even to a greater extent the United Nations, you know, the Security Council has passed resolution after resolution after resolution after resolution condemning this activity, sending new people. We're bending over backwards. Here this man lost a war in which American casualties happened and British casualties, and all these people made sacrifices in order to try and bring forward the promise of freedom in the Gulf and you know, try and eliminate some of the control that Saddam Hussein has over his people and the resources of that country. The fact that he continues to defy us, I think, is very upsetting to me, and I think is something which we need to act unilaterally on to either end his power, if that's what it takes. I would hate to see that happen, because that would require a full-scale operation, or to deal in some other constructive way with this issue.
Yes. Jason?
Well, learning from example, a lot of parallels of this situation can be drawn from World War II. Germany, undecidedly, everyone would agree to this, they were totally crushed during World War I. And yet, even after the entire world placed them under harsh economic sanctions, we basically closed off their borders. They managed to secretly build for World War II, the 1920s through the very, very early 1950s. Germany secretly built the second, third largest military force in the world. And, you know, the sad part is that people knew about it. You know, Poland, the first country, I believe the first country Germany came in and invaded during World War II, they knew about it. I mean, the Russians knew about it, Europe knew about it, everybody knew about it. And we just kept saying, tisk, 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 you shouldn't be doing that, but we didn't do anything to stop them. I mean, just learning from example. I mean, but when you actually look at Iraq, a lot of people would argue, oh, well, you know, it's a little bit more, you know, they have the right to vote there. Well, yes, they have the right to vote, but not many people know that in Iraq, the government gives you basically, unless you grow it, the government gives you food rationing. And Saddam Hussein, his official policy is you can vote for whoever you want, but if you don't vote for me, you don't get your food.
I see.
That's what his policy has always been. So it's not exactly, you know, World War II, Germany, Hitler inspired a sense of patriotism in his people, which is part of the reason that led him to such a great success. Saddam Hussein basically inspires a sense of terror into his people, which is largely his downfall. During the Gulf War, tens of thousands of Iraqi troops surrendered to us because they don't have the same loyalty that Nazi troops felt towards their leader.
I think this is an excellent point that we can bring up now, is that at the end of World War I, we ignored Germany. You know, we wanted to put World War I behind us, we wanted to ignore it, and we wanted to go on. And I think in large part that's something that the international community wants to do with Iraq, and with the Mideast. They want to just get past it. And I believe that that's totally inappropriate. We have to engage Iraq, we have to be a part of Iraq, and we have to be a part of her solutions. I don't want to persecute her people, I don't want to hurt her people, because all the crimes that were committed by Iraq were committed by her government, which is not really something which we can say that, the Iraqi people, their government is not really democratically elected. They aren't really free elections. And so I don't think it's fair to persecute the people. So with these food sanctions and stuff like that, I'm not sure that was the right approach. But we do have to find a way to deal with the Iraqi problem, and by confronting it, not by ignoring it. Whatever we do, if we simply ignore it and say, okay, Saddam, you've toughed it out for 7 years or whatever, we'll just leave you alone now. That's the worst possible thing we can do.
Well, if you also look at it, the U.S. has done this in the past. When we defeated Japan on their own turf, we helped rewrite their constitution. We kickstarted, and up until recently, they are one of the smallest nations in the world compared to their population, but they have one of the most outstanding economies to date.
I see.
Possibly we could do that with Iraq. They have a plenitude of wealth. They have oil resources far beyond the United States.
It's the government that impedes that ability to prosper.
I see. Well, to play devil's advocate, gentlemen, is Saddam Hussein justified in his secrecy and paranoia against the United States? We have found numerous CIA operations attempting to violently overthrow in some cases, his government, and indeed to usurp his power. How justified is his paranoia and secrecy?
I'd say he has a right to be paranoid, but he's taken outlandish efforts to act on it. He's gone way over. I mean, when you think about it, Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and now, Iraq. CIA operations have always, CIA and NSA working together, CIA operations have always been kind of looked upon as, the government looks at it, but they kind of cast a shady glance at it. They don't really want to acknowledge what's going on. But all the same, Saddam has a right to be paranoid, but the steps that he's, if I was him, I'd be paranoid.
Absolutely.
But the steps that he's taking are just a little bit too, like, oh, well, they're out to get me, so I'm going to pursue the growth of nuclear and chemical weapons to take out their country if need ever be.
Rather rash.
That's, we give him warnings, and what we get in return is evidence of chemical weapons and more warfare in the works.
In my opinion, we are justified in taking whatever action we do with Iraq. They were the aggressor. They attacked a peaceful nation, Kuwait, on whatever basis it was. That's unacceptable. You simply do not go in and take over a country. The world community acted. We threw Saddam Hussein out. We decimated his military as much as possible. And we said, listen, you've got to comply with this, this, and this, and this. And the Iraqi government has refused. Saddam Hussein has refused. And so long as he does refuse, and so long as he is a strategic really pawn in the way of the international community, where we're trying to go towards more freedom, more democracy, more free trade. I'm going to plug that again.
Yes.
That sort of thing. We're trying to open the world back up, and Saddam Hussein is trying to clamp it back down.
I see.
And that's unacceptable. He's been the aggressor. We've beaten him before, and I hate to say it. It hurts me a great deal. But if it's necessary to hit him again and to hit him where he'll feel it, that is the course of action that is prudent.
All right. Well, gentlemen, if we are justified, then let me ask you this. How much of the conflict in the Gulf War and the conflict now is due to UN sanctions, and how much is over oil and money and economics?
I'd have to say that they're contributing factors. That's all the credit I'd give them, and nothing more. When the media and the government has labeled Saddam Hussein as a madman, initially when I read that and I heard about it, I was kind of hesitant to. I was like, well, this is a man who got into a place of power, maybe not by the best means, but he is there nonetheless.
You can say that.
But then I saw more and more during the Gulf conflict. He was trying to win a war against practically the entire world. He's trying to win a war against the entire world with tanks that came around post-World War II. The actual tanks that they used during the Gulf War that Iraq used had to stop to fire and took 8 seconds after that to recharge their power supply enough to move again. That's going up against United States France, I forget who else was in the
most technologically advanced
Right.
countries in the world with, by far, vastly superior armed forces. State-of-the-art weapons. He
it's
was...
just, it leads me to think that this is truly a person who is not in their right mind. You know, it leads me to think that Saddam Hussein is just obsessed with making his country, he wants to make his country to be wonderful. He wants to best the United States and everyone else who tells him you can't do this. But at what cost? You know, most of his people, they're loyal to him, but he doesn't leave them much choice to be loyal or not.
Absolutely.
So I mean, the only conclusion I have is that he's just insane. He wants to make himself out to be the greatest there ever was. He's willing to do whatever it takes to get there, and he just doesn't have the means to do it.
Again, we've dealt with people like Saddam Hussein before. We have dealt with them, and it has taken millions upon millions upon millions of lives to get rid of them. The worst thing we can do, like I said before, you know, to your previous question, is that the worst thing we can do is ignore Saddam Hussein, because he is not something that will go away. He is a cancer. He will grow. He will spread his influence. He will do whatever it takes to destroy. He will destroy however many people it takes. He will, you know, he will annihilate his country if that is what he believes it takes. Hitler decimated one of the most beautiful countries on earth beforehand, Germany. You know, through World War II, we had to saturate, bomb the entire thing, destroyed lovely cities with beautiful palaces and wonderful art and a delightful people. But we were forced to destroy that nation because of a madman who was at the helm, and there was simply nothing. We were not engaged ahead of time to deal with the problem before it came to that, and I would simply hate to do that. But if that is what is necessary, that is what we'll do.
I see. So to be isolated is to be helpless, eh?
Absolutely. To be isolated is to invite future disaster, calamity, casualty, expense. It's the worst possible thing.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. On to our last subject, and a rather touchy one. Jonesboro, Arkansas. 2 children, one 13 years of age and one 11, fire numerous shots into a departing crowd, killing 5 before being apprehended. Just weeks later in Paducah, Kansas, a similar tragedy takes place. Children shooting and killing other human beings. Many have suggested remedies to the atrocities, but do we really understand the problem? The issue, is school violence a growing trend, and what can we do to halt it? Gavin.
Well, I think school violence is a growing trend, and I think that we can look at the patterns of stress in young people. It has grown astronomically. I think another thing that we can look at is young people are, in many times in city areas, so this is not necessarily specifically pertaining to Jonesboro, but young people are simply leaving school and walking the streets. And they're simply in charge of themselves. Parents don't seem to really have an invested interest in making sure that their children are doing something, you know, being involved in something, in some, I don't know, extracurricular activities, anything. Also, we can look at the decline of the moral fiber of the family, which directly, I believe, reflects on the moral fiber of our children. When you don't have children who, when you don't have parents, excuse me, who tell their children, listen, you've got an obligation to society, you know, to do certain things. You've got an obligation to yourself, and you've got an obligation to your family. And you need to fulfill all these obligations by, you know, being good and all these other things. I see it as a broader example of the decline of the morality of society. And that is something that I fear is taking place. And I think it's a slippery slope, as Mr. O'Brien would say. You know, by ignoring it, by not engaging the problem of American families being more involved with their children, which I think is, you can demonstrate that through almost anything. American families are not as integrated with their children. If you look at that, I think you can definitely see a correlation with that and distraught, stressed out students doing crazy things that, that normally would either be able to be prevented or controlled.
Jason?
I just wanted to point something out. When this first happened, there's one of the networks that's carried on cable around here, MSNBC, a conglomeration between Microsoft and NBC. They host an internet chat daily on local events. And when I went in there when this first happened, I went into this chat room and I just heard so many people screaming gun control and all this, that, and the other thing. And initially I read it, I thought, well, yeah, that does make some sense, but you got to remember, if these kids really wanted to hurt someone, you don't need a gun to do it.
And these are sicko kids. I mean, excuse me.
I mean,
we love our children, but these are people who have serious psychological problems, and they are not dealing with those problems. Now, I'm not a psychologist or psychoanalysis, but one thing that I do know is that if you have a very disturbed kid, whether you put a gun in their hand or a knife in their hand or a club in their hand or anything you put in their hand, they are going to do damage. It is not the guns which kill children. Now, again, I think this is part of the decline of the American family. We're not locking up our guns. We're not showing our children how to respect weapons, which is something that I think is very, very wrong. You know, these kids are going out and they're using their weapons to kill other people, and that is not what our God-given right to have a firearm is all about.
I see. Well, gentlemen, do you think that something like this can happen close to home in Hazlitt, give an example? And if so, how can we protect ourselves from this? And we find it very important to blame people in these situations. Now, is it fair to blame in part society? Are the children's parents at all accountable for some of their actions, please?
Absolutely.
I'd have to say definitely so. You know, lately a lot of the big things that have been cropping up on television are the new ratings, you know, TVY7 or you know, the different, I'm not sure what they all stand for. But when you don't have families that don't do things together, the ratings aren't going to matter. You know, when you have a kid who plops down in front of the television after school, watches it until he goes to bed, gets up the next day and does the same thing, if his parents aren't there to watch what he's watching, the ratings don't matter. They're not going to help.
Or at the very least to instill some kind of moral fiber and say, have a little bell go off in the kid's head and say, oh, Dirty Harry's blowing away somebody. That's bad. That's bad. You know, that's what you want, is that just that little tinge of conscience. If that's the only thing which, you know, which will save a life, at least that's time invested on the part of the parent and society to make sure that tinge of conscience is in there.
The thing that I find interesting is that if you look at the past decade, when these kind of events have happened, initially with my generation, when I grew up, I remember, you know, we'd go out and play, you know, cops and robbers and that kind of stuff, and play guns and stuff like that. But, you know, there was always a sense there of this is fun to play, but in real life, it's never the same thing. I think that as you look at these events keep happening, when they first really got a lot of publicity, people targeted the family, people targeted the children, people targeted the way they grew up, which are all perfectly fine explanations. You know, there's other explanations too, but those work also. Those contribute to it. But as time went on, they began happening more and more frequently. People, instead of looking at what they used to look at, they start looking at something else. They look at, oh, well, if we had had more control over the guns, this wouldn't have happened.
All right.
I see.
Again, I have to think, if these kids really wanted to hurt as many people as they did, and I mean, I remember the actual event was they set off a fire alarm, and when the people came out of the doors, they started shooting at them. It would have been just as easy to plant 2 chemical explosives outside the door and blow them as soon as the fire, you blow the fire alarm, give it 10, 20, 30 seconds, blow the charges. You don't need a gun. You can get online through the internet again. You can get anything online. You can get blueprints to weapons. And the biggest one you can find is how to make bombs out of household cleaning detergents and stuff like that. It's incredibly easy to find. It doesn't, you know, gun control and weapon control isn't the only issue here.
I think, you know, to take an example, you have some apartments, and they can't lift a grand piano through the staircase up to a top floor apartment, so they have to wheel it up on this little wheel. Well, there's the guys which are pulling it up, you know, pulling the piano up, and then there's somebody who's walking down below, and for some reason the rope snaps, and down goes the piano and squashes somebody. We're going to blame the piano. Bad piano, bad piano, bad piano. That doesn't make any sense. It's the guy who tied the knot. It's the guy who selected the knot, or the kind of rope. Who's at fault? That's what we're talking about. It is not the thing. It's not the inanimate object which hurts someone.
Yes.
Like automobiles. It's when a car hits somebody, it's not the car we blame. It's the person. It's exactly the same, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, gentlemen.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure having you. And if anyone has questions about any of our programs here on TV25, you can call here at the studio at 339-7358. I'm Elliot Liu, and this has been To The Point.